Welcome to this edition of Faithful Questions. Let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for bringing us together this evening and for the many ways that you bless us. We thank you particularly for the technology that makes a talk like this possible and for your wisdom that you have handed down to us through the ages. We ask all of this through Christ our Lord and Savior. Amen. Okay, welcome everyone. Those of you online, those of you here in person, glad to have you this evening. Tonight's topic is actually a bit of a change. For those of you who've been here for most of the sessions, you knew this was something else earlier in the year and has been changed to this. Mostly at Father George's request, actually. He said a lot of people have been asking, and he thought maybe it would be a good change. So, when is it moral to fight a war? I did this talk a little over a year and a half ago, I think, or I changed it a little bit, but with the war in Ukraine, obviously, it became a little bit more present of an issue. Overview for tonight. First, we're going to start with kind of a baseline thought of the idea of our mindset being pro-life, that everything we do starts with the idea of concern for life, and that affects even this, that the heart of our teachings regarding war start with the idea of life. Then we're going to talk about the history of Just War Doctrine, how it has developed over the centuries. As Catholics, obviously, we allow for the idea that doctrine develops over time, and there have been a number of wise and good developments. Have our intermission. After that, we will talk about the modern teaching as it currently stands, and then finish up with what our role should be as citizens to make sure that the right things, to the best of our ability, are happening. Introductions. We'll start with in-person stuff. For all of you here, of course, we have refreshments and all of that. Feel free to get up and get them at any time. Just make sure you go around the back so both you don't trip on all the electronics and you don't have to worry about darting past the camera. For asking questions, just make sure you raise your hand. We will bring a microphone to you, and this is important because people on the live stream want to hear what the question is. So please wait for the microphone. Hold it very close to your mouth. This is one of those microphones that's very distance sensitive. So you should be able to hear yourself over the speakers. If you can't, bring it in even closer. And then, of course, hand it back when you're done. For those of you online, it's a little bit more complicated. Best thing you can do is get logged in on YouTube with any sort of Google account that you have. That will enable the comment section. It will open it up, and you can comment in the video. And so all we ask that you do is get logged in, and then you can comment all you want. You can say, this bozo has no idea what he's talking about, have lots of fun. But if you actually want to ask me a question, start the comment with all capitals, Deacon Question dash, and then your question after that within the same comment. And that way we know it's something you would like to have asked. If you don't have any sort of Google account, which is surprising, because if you have a Gmail account or a Google account or a YouTube account or any of those, any of them can be used here. But if for some reason you have managed to escape the Borg that is Google, you can go ahead and go to deaconken.org/blog/chat, and there's an open comment section there that you can use the same way as the other one. Okay, so let's talk about what it means to be pro-life, because pro-life has in many ways become an acronym from being against abortion, which is a wonderful starting place and a very important topic. But really, if we think about that term pro-life, it means a lot more than that. It means everything from being anti-infanticide, for a social safety net that protects people who need helping, being caring for the immigrant and the refugee. It requires that we care about war and then making sure that it is only done when appropriate. It affects the end of life with issues like euthanasia and assisted suicide. It also goes into issues like the way we view sex and sexuality and our feelings against prostitution and pornography that are all about the dehumanization of the people who are being abused in those industries. Being pro-marriage, pro-international aid to help other countries in the world that need our help. All of this fits into the umbrella of our concern for life, being pro-life. And obviously tonight we're going to focus on just one, the issue of when a war would be just, but really it is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. But I think it's very important to set that stage, that the idea of war needs to be put in the place of being about the protection of life and the concern for life. So let's start with history. We will go all the way back to Augustine. Augustine wrote a fair amount on the subject of the issue of war. And he makes a number of statements in a number of different works. I've kind of summarized them here. He talks about the idea that we have to be thinking not in terms of love of violence, cruelty, or enmity, right? That we can't be coming from a place of hatred towards the other, that we can't be coming in from a place, and this is more of a guy problem for the most part, but just a desire to be really physical and wanting to fight and those kinds of things. That this should never be our motivation for war. And probably that was a little bit more of an issue in his era than today, although I do think it plays out in more subtle ways. He uses this term of peace is not sought in order to provoke war, but war is engaged in order to attain peace. So if you must go to war, his perspective would be, you have to do it with the goal of peace, right? What we're wanting is peace, and war may need to be used as a means to get to peace, but that must be its ultimate goal. The ultimate goal must be peace. And this is one that sometimes doesn't get as much focus today because we try to avoid the war in the first place, but he was one of the first to really bring forward this idea that even in the midst of war, or even just after a war is completed, we have to remember the human indignity of those that we are fighting. So we have to have that spirit of the peacemaker, is the way he puts it, that even when you conquer, it's all about caring for them, leading them back to peace. So this is 4th and 5th century, right? He was born mid 4th century, died early to mid 5th century. And there were some minor, additional commentaries on the subject, but actually the next big figure to really make a big dent in the topic was good old Tommy A, right? He's St. Thomas Aquinas spoke to so many important things. His Summa Theologica laid down a number of important points, but one of the biggies where it really made a dent was in the area of war, amongst others. I really shouldn't limit him in any way. So he comes up with a number of principles himself. He says, first, war must be waged by a properly instituted authority such as the state, right? That it's not war if you're having a dispute with your neighbor and you as an individual act on it in a murderous fashion, right? That war is something that governments, societies do, and you can only go into war from that perspective, that if war is necessary, it must be handled at that level. You can't handle it at the level of the vigilante or the protest even. It has to be done at the level of a proper societal authority, the normal one, of course, being the government. Next, he talks about the need of it being for a good and just purpose rather than self-gain. And so the key here is that anything that is merely personal or societal interest, as in we will be more powerful, is not good enough, right? We have to have something more than just this will be good for us. We will whatever, our gas prices will go down. That of its own right is not a justification for going to war. We have to have some issue of actual justice, not just improvement, that we must be fighting for. It can never be just an exercise of power or improvement. Third, and again, this very much reflects back to Augustine, is that the goal must be peace. That where we are headed is towards peace, not towards that this is not just that the goal itself is something else. That we are eventually hoping for is the idea that the world and society will be a better place for everyone if the war must be fought. And this is often referred to as having right intention. So these were kind of the big principles he brought to the table, and a lot of times actually he is accredited with what happened in the next couple of centuries afterwards, but for the historically precise, that's not actually true. His contribution was at about to this level. But about a century later, there was what was called the Salamanca expansion. I guess a little more than a century, 200 years later. And they really further developed what Thomas Aquinas had already started or had already developed things. And so they kind of take some of what he says in a little bit more vague sense and makes it a little bit more, to say it in a modern way, bullet pointy. That you need these four things: the just authority, that's the government, the just cause, the right intention, and then actually probably a big piece that they added that was a little lacking before then is the last resort piece, that there's no other way to accomplish this than to go to war. They also add the idea that some things that while they didn't put them in the four criteria, are hiding amongst them, that if you look at the modern's sense of how we look at it, these things are hiding in there. So as I said, the real big addition piece was a piece of last resort, but you will also find a renewed emphasis on that you have a reasonable possibility of success. Going into war where you know it's going to be a disaster and it's not going to turn out well is not a good idea. They kind of, as the last resort piece, they also bring in this idea of that the evil caused is commensurate with the evil being fought against. So it must be something that you're really remembering how much evil, how much death, how much destruction happens in war, and making sure that what you're fighting for is greater than that it's not something that is more trivial. To go back to one of my favorite Dr. Seuss books growing up, which side of the bread you need to butter is not a good enough reason to... Anybody read that book, The Butter Battle book? I feel like I'm staring at blank faces. It's my favorite Dr. Seuss book. That's what they were fighting over. They're fighting over which side of the bread should be buttered. Obviously, no matter how much you are right on that subject, it just is not nearly of enough importance to be worth what war might do. That was more of a Cold War book, so it really is emphasizing this idea of each side continuing to have more of these huge defensive things in a very Dr. Seuss kind of way. So if you haven't read it, it's a fun book for your kids. I am unusually way ahead of schedule. It shows intermission reminders as the next slide. I don't know how I got this far into it this quickly. I must have breezed over a bunch of stuff I usually spend more time on. But there is a lot in the second half. So maybe what we'll do is pause for some questions of as general nature as we want, and then we'll do an early intermission before we continue on to the second half. So there's some questions that people, kind of came here hoping to have answered that maybe we could start with in a general sense, even if it's not so much in what I've covered so far. All right, wait for the...
Can you give examples of a just cause and a right intention, and how those may be different or the same?
So how to differentiate between just cause and right intention. Okay, so right intention has more to do with what you are doing amongst the war. So if you are torturing the people who you've captured, you're kind of missing your own point, if you know what I mean, right? If the idea is this country that's attacking me, I need to fend them off because they're going to try to take over our country and rule it as dictators. Okay, great. We want freedom. We don't want that. So we need to fight this war. So that would be a just cause. Mid-war, we now are winning or doing whatever we're doing, and we capture, 100,000 troops of theirs, and we put them in appropriate prisoner of war camps until the war is over. If we are torturing them and doing all of the things that are inappropriate to do, this actually one of the good places of the Geneva Convention of saying you have to treat prisoners of war appropriately, that would be messing up the right intention, because you're actually violating your own principles of caring about life and caring about people when you're not treating those people who you've captured humanely. So intention is more about what you're doing amidst the war than the other, and just cause is more what caused you to go into the war. And both are obviously very important, right? So like to go into Ukraine is to speak to some particulars, right? There are a lot of accusations right now by both sides. I won't try to detangle who's right and who's wrong, because I have no authority or knowledge that's special that any of you don't have. I just watch CNN and read the newspaper and do what I can. But of war crimes, right? And so this would be one or both sides, and there seems to be a lot more accusations against the Russians of violating the right intention. So even if someone were to come in and say that Russia has a right, has a just cause here, which I think is a stretch, but we'll leave that on the table, they're going beyond that and violating right intention if they are indeed slaughtering and using mass graves and all of that for the Ukrainians as is alleged, right? Yeah. Nice and close. Just nice and close to your mouth.
Is this okay?
No, I gotta go closer. Just right up to it.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. I understand that suicide is not considered, you don't want to commit suicide. But on the other hand, if you are a prisoner of war and you have certain information and you're wondering if you can stand the torture that you may have as a prisoner of war, is suicide ever acceptable with the thought that you would be saving others from torture and death or giving things away? Because a lot of people had cyanide pills. A lot of officers during the Second World War.
I have never heard any defense of specifically suicide in that regard. We generally are pretty strongly that there's never a cause for suicide. I think you could make an argument for what I'll call low probability attempts to escape. Kind of, in other words, saying forcing their hand to where, look, if you're either going to torture me to death to get the information out of me, I'm going to do everything in my power to make so that I'm trying to escape, but you have to be the one to kill me. I'm not going to do it to myself. I could see some corner case where some moral theologian could argue that, but I think it would be one the church would be very reluctant to go to. That really we have to try the other path of doing everything in our power to not give up information that we shouldn't be giving up. And if we have to do things to try to escape because they're torturing us as they shouldn't be, then if that ends up in our death because of that, well, so be it. But I have never once heard in that department a defense of the idea of suicide. Oh, one over here. Any online, Peter? Nope. Okay. Yeah, nice and close.
Thank you for hosting tonight. I'm kind of thinking in my mind about the Crusades. If you'll touch on any history of the Crusades in particular, can the Church or the Vatican declare a war? And if so, how is the process of recruiting soldiers or funding a church-declared war?
That is an excellent question. I'm going to start with a little bit of a tangent, but I promise I'm coming back. Let's start with the issue of what we've done in the past, right? The church is definitely willing to admit it has had moments of imperfection, and there are definitely aspects of the Crusades that the church has specifically apologized for, and admissions of we did wrong. So that we did it in the past doesn't mean it was right. But there's some notable differences if we were to try to be defending aspects of the Crusades between then and now. And the big difference is the church as an institutional entity no longer has any state control anywhere. I mean, it's the Vatican City, but that's so trivial as to be meaningless, right? But when you go back to the Middle Ages, not only were there the Vatican States, which were more than half of Italy, there was also the Holy Roman Empire, for which the Pope was, while not executive, an important, influential person for whom he could basically get them to do things. Not in a moral sense, but in a political sense. And so in that sense, church and state were far more intertwined. And so I think you could make an argument, irrelevant of whether they did the right thing, that in the Middle Ages they were closer to meeting this requirement that they be a just authority because they were intertwined with the state. Whereas today, while they may be able to morally call for action being needed, they do not have the authority as a state to actually be the one to go do it, right? Now, modern history would suggest we are pretty reluctant to say yes to any of those things. If you look at the modern American wars, we got a teensy bit of support for our invasion of Afghanistan. But other than that, you're going all the way back to World War II before you can find a meaningful support of anything the U.S. has done as far as actual military action. So, not only do we no longer have the just authority, we are definitely far more on the side of peace. And we'll come to this a little bit towards the end, but the Pope actually had some recent statements that not very popular with American voices, basically suggesting that there are avenues to peace that the West is ignoring, that we need to be considering, specifically around the stuff around NATO and all of that. And while, again, I can't personally speak to how right he is, and he does not have ultimate prudential judgment, he could be making some error that he not realize from a particulars standpoint. I think his mindset is very important to observe, that are we really considering the possibilities that we should be considering to find a way to bring an end to this? And I don't know that this is true, so I don't want to suggest it is, but if it was really true that all we had to do to end this was to say, make a decree that Ukraine will not join NATO, and the small pockets that were already in the middle of a civil war trying to fight to be independent from Ukraine would be allowed to be independent from Ukraine. If that's all it took, the West should be doing those things. The debate of whether that's actually true is I think where the rubber hits the road. That's very hard to figure out, right? So, but I bring it up not so much to get into the particulars, but to speak to how much the modern church is aching to avoid war and willing to consider significant compromises that a lot of people are very reluctant to make. All right. Got to at least 25 minutes in. I think that's enough. We can take an early intermission. Quick intermission reminder, particularly for those of you on the phone, or on the phone. It's like I'm in the Zoom meeting. On the live stream, we will have a 5-minute intermission, but you are about a minute behind us in time as far as you seeing me talk versus when I actually said the words. So what I want you to do is, if you have a question that you've been holding for intermission, go ahead and type it in now, and we will have a Q&A period, mostly focused on you since we did one in the room before. But get it in now so that it's there when we get to that part after intermission. And as a reminder, get logged in on YouTube using your Gmail account, your Google account, your YouTube account, and put in all capitals Deacon Question Dash. If you're struggling, you can't figure that out, you can't find your old password for that account, go to deaconken.org/blog/chat. Do the same thing. We'll see you in 5 minutes. Okay, we're back. Time for some questions and answers. I know we got at least one on the text line, however we're going to call it.
And the question is, how do we judge the World War II bombing of Hiroshima, Japan?
Yes, so just stumbling into the very deep end of a topic that, again, many Americans don't want to hear what the church has to say. The church is unequivocal on this front that non-combatants cannot be targeted as part of war. And nuclear weapons, almost by default, target. I guess there's some theoretical possibility where you had a really, really small nuclear weapon or detonated in some very unusual place where there were no non-combatants around. But in a practical, normal sense, and what we did in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki violated the principle of you cannot target non-combatants, and therefore violates the principle of just intention. Let me address the counter-argument that is made, right? The standard counter-argument is, and I'm sure I'm going to be a little rough on my numbers here, but something like 100,000 people died in Hiroshima and 50,000 people died in Nagasaki, and that's 150,000 people, and it ended the war. And that saves somewhere between 1 million and 2 million lives, so the argument goes, because of what would have been necessary to conquer the island in more traditional fashions. First of all, the church is very, very suspicious, and with good reasons, of theoretical futures, right? That's a proposal of what might have happened, but it is not necessarily how it would have gone, and there were other things to consider besides a direct invasion. I've actually studied up on this one a lot, and I'm always a little reluctant to go to this place because the fundamental arguments, what I'm about to say, don't care. The idea that you shouldn't be targeting non-combatants and you can't take a theoretical look at the future are the more principled points. But, as is so often the case, when the church takes that kind of high-level view, when you start digging into it, you realize that the narrative being shared is not nearly as clean as we are told. So let me tell you some facts about specifically Nagasaki. The day that we bombed Nagasaki was also the day that Russia invaded Manchuria, exactly. The War Council in Japan was already in the process of meeting, of deciding what to do about that, when the news of Nagasaki came in. And of course, there is no way to know, because actually even those people in the room couldn't fully tell you, since it came down to such a contentious decision where there was a tie and the emperor had to break it. So it's not like they know where that discussion was going. But the point is, the discussion might have gone there anyway, even if we hadn't have dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. So at a minimum, the idea that that bomb was necessary is highly contentious, even using the exact same argument. Then you go into things about how bad the food and material situation was in Japan because of our blockades, and that there's good reason to believe if we had kept them for a few more months, particularly with what was happening in Manchuria, making it so their last remaining place where they were able to get a significant amount of goods and materials to Japan, even though we wiped out about 3/4 of it every time they tried to bring it across the Strait. Is the Sea of Japan's the inside body of water, whatever it is. But nevertheless, they were still getting some of it across. And if Manchuria fell apart, they would lose all that. There are strong reasons to believe we wouldn't have actually needed to invade to bring an end to the war. Am I saying that's true? No, I'm not saying that's true. But I'm saying there is enough doubt, there is enough confusion, that the presumption that it was a given, 150,000 lives lost, 2 million lives saved, is a little bit of a rhetorical trick. It is not that simple. It is not that clean. And it does not wipe away the fact that we targeted non-combatants. Full stop. So the church says no, we cannot do that. We should not have done that, and that was an illegal act of war. I know there are tons of people who disagree with that, including many Catholics, but that is the teaching of the church. Other questions that came in. All right. So let's go on to now modern teaching. So I've kind of given some history of how we got to here, and that has led to what the Catechism currently says. So a big part of the reason I bring up the history is to say that this just didn't come out of nowhere. It's not like when we put the Catechism together in the late 80s, we just, scratched our head and said, this sounds nice. There was a very specific development that brought us to here, and you can see everything I've been talking about and its development in what is in the current catechism. So this is paragraph 2309. The strict condition for legitimate defense by military force require rigorous consideration. The gravity of decision makes it subject to the rigorous conditions of moral legitimacy. At one and the same time, meaning all of these things must be true. The damage inflicted by the aggressor on a nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. So to some degree, this answers a little bit of that vagueness of our earlier terming of just cause, right? They use some a little bit more, at least more elaborative words. All other means of putting it to an end must have been shown to be impractical or ineffective. There must be serious prospect of success. So this is, again, now bringing a little bit more to the fore what already the Salamanca expansion had put kind of in the background. The use of arms must not produce evils and disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. And I'm forgetting where this subnote I came from comes from. The power of modern means of destructions weigh heavily in evaluating this condition. I'm not absolutely sure that's in the text of 2309, but I think it may be in a footnote or something that they bring up. These are the traditional elements enumerated in what is called Just War Doctrine. The evaluation of these conditions for moral legitimacy belongs to the prudential judgment of those who have responsibility for the common good. So it's interesting, they kind of bring the just authority thing a little bit outside of it, right? They talk about the criteria of when it's okay, and then finally at the very end talk about the need for this being coming from the government. That, those who have the responsibility for the common good is, in this sense, the government. 2312, a few paragraphs later. The church and human reason both assert the permanent validity of moral law during armed conflict. The mere fact that war has regrettably broken out does not mean that everything becomes licit between the warring parties. So again, kind of back to those four criteria. The other thing that was missing there was the right intention part of it. And so here in 2312, they're bringing that back into the fray. Non-combatant, wounded soldiers and prisoners must be respected and treated humanely. Actions deliberately contrary to the law of nation and to its universal principles are crimes, as are the orders that command such actions. Blind obedience does not suffice to excuse those who carry them out. Thus, the extermination of a people, nation, or ethnic minority must be condemned as a mortal sin. One is morally bound to resist orders that command genocide. Obviously, this comes in remembering that Pope John Paul II, who was both a Polish Catholic at the time of the Holocaust, which was mostly done in Poland, influenced heavily this being in there. It's not that it doesn't apply generally, but I think the reason it is given so much oomph is because of the Holocaust during World War II. And in particular, the defense that was used by many second-level generals in the Nazi Party of saying they were following orders, right? That this is going into surprising detail considering the broadness of this context, of saying that's not okay. You can't just say you were following orders. If something truly immoral is being asked of you, you have a responsibility to resist it. So it goes into that. 23:14, every act of war directed to the so kind of coming, this is where they're going to get into the Hiroshima case. Every act of war directed to the indiscriminate destruction of whole cities or vast areas with their inhabitants is a crime against God and man, which merits firm and unequivocal condemnation. A danger of modern warfare is that it provides the opportunity to those who possess modern scientific weapons, especially atomic, biological, or chemical weapons, to commit such crimes. So it doesn't limit this as well to the nuclear weapons. It also looks to biological and chemical weapons as well. So the church is pretty clear on this subject and does not give any kind of caveating. And if you look at the Catechism, it will definitely have caveating when it feels appropriate to suggest some sort of lives lost trade-off. So that is what is in our catechism. Every modern pope very much supports these ideas. It is what we stand for. We want war to be an absolute last resort that we only do when absolutely necessary, and when we do it with a emphasis on doing it as morally as absolutely possible, which is difficult, but we must never compromise that intention. Now, the church historically has used three terms to speak to these things, and so I wanted to bring up something that you will see not in the catechism itself, but in a number of documents in the, relatively speaking, modern church. So it's, the X is not what it is. Just something bellums, and it depends on what it is. So I'm going to go through them one by one. So jus ad bellum is the ethics of declaring war. Ad being for, adding or doing, right? So we speak to the idea that there are ethics to each stage here. There's ethics to declaring war, and we've kind of gone over these already, but just to repeat, only by a legitimate authority, only when the cause is just. Only when we plan to have right intention, only when it is a last resort. Only when there's a reasonable chance of success. All of the things we've already talked about. And then there is jus in bellum, and excuse me for my Latin pronunciation, I'm sure I'm all over the place. Ethics during war, in or is like in. There must be discrimination. We can't be going after non-combatants. There must be proportion. We must be looking at the good achieved versus the harm done, and taking all of that into account. And then finally, there is jus post bellum, the ethics of the victor. And now I'm taking us all the way back to Augustine. When men go to war, what they want to impose on their enemies, when men go to war, what they want is to impose on their enemies the victor's will and call it peace. So this is not his what he thinks should be. He's saying what all too often happens, right? And actually a wonderful example of where this went awry is what happened after World War I, right? The West won World War I. Germany was defeated, and as opposed to the Treaty of Versailles trying to find the right balance of ensuring a long-term peace, they were very harsh and vindictive, maybe is another word, against Germany, blaming them for everything that happened, blaming them for the loss of life, when it was pretty muddled how it all came about. And so caused them to have to pay reparations and all of these things that went too far. And the result of that was eventually that the Nazi Party was able to gain such support by fighting back against the injustice of the Versailles Treaty. And now obviously they went way beyond those right objections, but the idea is that planted a seed that went somewhere horrific, and that if we had been more focused at the end of World War I on peace and ultimate justice, World War II may have never happened. Obviously, again, you can't go too far down the what-if path because you never know where things would have gone, but that is an example of this sort of thinking, of being very concerned with true peace, true justice, and not being vindictive, not being punitive in our mindset. All people, even those who have fought against us in war, are made in the image of God, and we must have solidarity with these people concerning what will be to their benefit. And I already brought up the Germans after World War I. So, what are we to do with this knowledge and information? How are we to, because we're just regular citizens. Last time I checked, nobody in the room here is the President of the United States, so our authority in the matter is a little limited. How can we have a good influence? One is, I think, to start to just teach people this stuff. Teach people the idea that there are criteria that we can use, and that those criteria will help us make good decisions. As can be seen, it's not saying there's never a time for war, but it is saying that those times have to be very carefully decided and only done in limited cases. And being objective, it helps us keep hyper-emotionalism out of the situation. It gives us some clear metrics and goals to shoot for. And I think if you look at the big missteps of the United States post-World War II, if we had been more rigorous as a country of applying just war doctrine, we would have avoided a lot of the conflicts that caused us the most heartache. So just sharing this, that whenever you have a conversation with somebody that kind of goes down this direction, you don't have to be patronizing, but bring it into the equation, help them understand that it exists. It's something that goes so far back in Christian history, we don't even have to rely on it as a purely Catholic thing. Anybody who has a general sense of Christian morality, which is almost all Americans, even if they don't call themselves Christian, I think can look at these criteria and see the benefit of them. I mean, even if they may object to some, they can see where it's at least something to discuss and debate. So bringing up that this exists, bringing up that it is something to use as a tool, defending it where people aren't very sympathetic to it, all of these things will make it so more often in the future this will be part of the discussion when we are talking about how to deal with the evils of the world, which are real. And then the next thing is when the moments come, and I have one a little bit more specific to Ukraine after this side that I added. This one here is from my last time I gave this talk. But we do have a responsibility to call out against immoral calls for war. So often, and I've found this very interesting as I've studied more of what we've done, what has gotten the American people to go to war is something hugely emotional. Like, even when we were perhaps a little bit too reluctant, it was some emotional piece that pushed us over the edge. And here what I'm referring to is Pearl Harbor, right? Before Pearl Harbor, Americans wanted nothing to do with the evils in the world, nothing to do with helping Britain defend itself. We were just like, we don't want any part of this anymore. And then Pearl Harbor happened, which was a horrible thing, but our reaction to it was so emotional. It was the emotions that pushed us over the finish line. And so I want to be very clear. I'm not saying our involvement in World War II was bad. That is not my point. My point is the thing that got us from not willing to willing to, even in a case where there was good moral argument for the war, was something that hit us in a very emotional way as a people. Not a dispassionate, logical approach. And that can work out very poorly. And if you look at what happened in I guess it's the Second Gulf War, and so the weapons of mass destruction and all of the fear that went along with that we were basically willing to believe that it was true with not enough evidence. Ugh, I think a camera just turned off. Camera 2 just turned off on us. All right. That was the microphones go through the cameras, and one of the cameras just turned off, so it shorts out the line when it does that. I think we would not have been willing to take such little evidence for the weapons of mass destruction if we hadn't have been in the emotionally fearful place that we were after 9/11. So one thing we can hugely do as Catholics is keep calling people back to a more rational, a more logical place to make sure that the reasons they're considering war are right and true, not hyper-emotional. We also see this, I think, and this last line I think I did add for this time, is an unwillingness to compromise because we are right. And we see this a bit more with Ukraine, where clearly the idea that Ukraine is an independent country that deserves to exist, the Catholic Church supports and defends. And the fact that somebody might be willing to attack them, again, hits us in a very emotional place. And we say, this isn't right. And that it's fine to feel that way. But where do we go with that emotion? And I'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide here. Just being right is not enough. You also need to be analyzing, okay, I might be right, but is what we were considering proportionate? How is this going to play out? All of those other things that are in the just war criteria need to be considered. These emotions can play out very poorly and cause escalations that wouldn't happen if we weren't reacting emotionally and ignoring things like just war doctrine. An example that has really gotten under my skin, although luckily it seems to have subsided in the last few weeks, but is the people who are calling for a no-fly zone in Ukraine not recognizing that what they are suggesting is declaring war. Because as soon as you send a U.S. jet into Ukrainian territory to shoot down a Russian plane, that's war. There's no equivocating at that point. That's not just aiding the Ukrainians. It is crossing the line to saying we should be proactively declaring war on Russia because of this. Now, I guess someone could try to make that argument, but my point here is they're not making that argument. They're acting as if a no-fly zone is some trivial little thing and approaching it from an emotional perspective and not honestly coming to terms with the fact that what they are proposing is declaring war. And they're saying it in a way where they can either unintentionally or intentionally delude themselves or the people they're talking to that that's what they're proposing. Another one is when Russia was really backed up, it was that huge, long thing outside of Kyiv, the big transport thing with the Russians where they couldn't get through. They were stuck. I forget all the details. And the thought was, gosh, if we could just take them out, wouldn't that be awesome? And I sympathize with that desire. Well, let's send in, I forget who it was. Somebody said, let's send in some unmarked planes, or Chinese marked planes and say they did it. Again, that you just know that is not well thought out. Or a more recent one, I forget, there was some senator who in some hearing recently said, we are at war. No, we are not. We need to be careful about our words. We need to say things that are appropriate, that aren't escalatory. Because every time we say things like this, the Russians hear it, the Ukrainians hear it, the West hears it, and it changes the needle on where all of those people are. And if we could be more clear and decisive with our words, we could be more clear about what we are and are not willing to do, and that would also, I think, move along peace talks. Next up, we can continue to speak out against immoral actions during war. It is absolutely right to keep highlighting the things that are happening in Ukraine that are clearly inappropriate. Now, again, the hard part is not so much looking at the set of facts we are given and saying, if those facts are true, that is immoral. The hard part right now is whether those facts are true. And so we do have to be a little cautious about not being foolish and accepting as fact somebody's assertion. They might be right, but in war there is a lot of attempts to use propaganda and these sorts of things to your benefit. And this has been true for centuries. And so we have to be a little cautious to not just accept all propaganda about what's happening in the war as true. But nevertheless, we can at least say, well, if that's true, that is a war crime, and phrase it in a way where we're not necessarily, agreeing that for sure it must be true if we don't have that sort of clarity. Another big thing, and I think our parish is doing wonderful in this department, we're doing a lot of things, is to act charitably to the victims of war, right? There are a number of Ukrainians who have moved to this region. There's a very large Ukrainian community in the Sacramento area. I think that's kind of centered around Citrus Heights, but many of them kind of bleed this way towards Roseville. And that's been true long before this war, but of course when the war happened and people are getting out, they're going to their relatives and whatever in the region. So we have been providing assistance to them, doing everything we can. Our country has been pretty good at accepting refugees from Ukraine, and so doing things to help them come here, and then also sending aid into the country. We've been doing a lot of that. So this is an area where I think there's been some strength in our parish, and probably because it's the area where it's easiest for us to do meaningful action. And so we are. And I think we should feel good about that, because it is an important piece of the war thing, of making sure that we're not only just looking at what's happening in the war sense, but helping the people who are affected by that war. So, big picture, that's what I had for tonight. I guess I am in an hour, so that's okay. Let's go through the conclusion reminders, first things, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. To that end, those of you online, get your questions in now. The person who had the Hiroshima question, I bet you put that in pretty early, but it didn't show up till about a minute before the intermission was over. So there's definitely an issue of delays. Get your questions in right away. So as I'm going through all the conclusion slides, they'll be here when we get to the Q&A at the end. Same information as before. Oops, old slide here. That text message thing at the bottom is no longer true. We dumped that a while back, and I just haven't removed it. When I reused the slides, I forgot to check it and find it. So, but in any case, on YouTube, make a comment, all capitals, Deacon Question dash, or go to deaconken.org/blog/chat. Do the same thing. All right. Everything we think about war starts with the idea of the concern of the protection of life. And sometimes that does mean you have to go to war. The way you protect life is by going to war. But it has to be motivated in that way. And that's what the criteria we have are designed to do. They're trying to make it a last resort, and only when, at the end of the day, what will happen is the protection of life. The criteria obviously call out far more in detail how you go about thinking about that, but this is the end result. We are trying to save life, care about life. I think we should always remember that when we're looking at those criteria and we're wondering how to apply them, having that underlying bedrock of life is important will help us understand where those criteria are coming from, and so we're more likely to apply them appropriately. Satisfaction survey, as always, we have a satisfaction survey for those of you online. You just click the show more, and there's a link in there directly to it. Go there. It takes just a couple minutes. I really appreciate your feedback. It's also the place to suggest topics for the future. For all of you here, they're over on the table over there. If you haven't already got one, I think most of you have. Just fill it out, and you can leave it back on the table. And again, I really appreciate your feedback. If you want to be anonymous, that's perfectly fine. It's not at all about that. The nice thing about putting your name down is if there is something that I'd like to follow up with so that I can better understand how to improve, I know who you are and I can follow up. But I guarantee you it's never going to be about how dare you question my talk. I've never once said that to anybody. It's really just about how can I make these better. So please do that online, please, and also here in the room. Next time, it is finally time for our summer break. I feel like this year was a very long year to get through all these talks. I think in part because I couldn't have people for all of things. It's been a while. But we will take a break now until September. We will start in September. I don't think my calendar for next year has been approved yet by the parish, but I did request basically the same time slot, second Tuesday of the month, 7 o'clock here in the Morris Hall. But I don't think they actually have finished all of their planning for the Faith Formation program and all of that, so I don't think that is official yet. I'm always looking for topic suggestions, so please, in your feedback forms or just something comes to you in the middle of summer, email me, let me know. This is just the more information slide. Basically, it's really simple. Either go to deaconken.org or email me at deaconken.org or go to youtube.com, Deacon Ken Crawford. As long as you know my name, it's pretty easy, okay? Finally, a couple more actually here. Sorry, spiritual direction. I've been talking about this the last 2-3 months. I have started offering spiritual direction in a more formal sense. It's a monthly direction program using an Ignatian model from St. Ignatius. I went through a 2-year training program to learn how to be a good Ignatian spiritual director. The expectation of the participants is that you're willing to put in a half hour a day of directed prayer based on where we want to go with your prayer life. And the way it works is every month we go over what happened the last month and what you're feeling called to and what you want to change, and then we come up with the plan for the coming month. And it's not about me telling you what to do, it's about me suggesting ideas of how you can continue to improve your prayer life. I'll offer scripture passages to consider using as a basis for prayer and all of that sort of stuff. So it is not counseling, it is direction. The goal here is to help you continue to grow closer to God by looking at your prayer life. And as with so many things in life, right, we do better when we get a little bit of outside, just like I ask for your feedback on how these talks are. having that kind of feedback on where I can improve my prayer life is helpful, and hopefully do that. It is not free. I do ask for a $500 a year contribution. It takes a fair amount of my time, not only an hour a month specifically, but also I spend a couple hours on top of that thinking about things to suggest and give and all of that. So for those who don't know, deacons are not paid. We're an entirely volunteer position. And I could imagine some point in my life, probably when the kids were a little closer to the back end of college, where I could consider quitting my job and making this my main means of income. And that would allow me to direct a lot more people. Right now, I really need to keep the limit to somewhere around 6 to 8 people. So making this something that is paid is something that helps lead that direction. I currently have one-year scholarship from one of my existing directees. He thinks it's so awesome that he is willing to pay for somebody who can't afford it. So if you are someone who feels like, I would do this, but the $500 is a big barrier for me, I do have a scholarship for this year for you to consider. So if you're interested in that, let me know. The way to do it is you go to deaconken.org/spiritual-direction, and in there it has the questions for you to answer, to put in an email, and a lot of them are just very practical. When can you meet? Because if it's just while I'm at work, that's not going to go well. Those sorts of things, and all of that. So go look at how the process works there and send me the email saying you're interested. Subscribing on YouTube, always important. 1,000 subscribers is the big mark you want to hit. Only 771 to go, so if you are not yet a subscriber of mine, you can get me to 770 or lower. So please, particularly for those of you online, if you haven't subscribed, click the subscribe button and subscribe to my channel. All right, that's enough on the conclusion stuff. Questions? We'll start with anything online. Nothing online, so then we'll come to the room.
Two questions. First one, you talked about last resort, and you also went on all other means. Now that can be very fuzzy as far as who looks at as far as what is last resort. What are some guidelines or things that the church has identified as looking at when the last resort has occurred? Second is, has there been anything about sanctions, especially economic sanctions, which would have an effect on people other than the direct people within fighting, if you want to call it.
Yep.
And has there been anything about sanctions, specifically economic sanctions?
Two excellent questions. Unfortunately, on the second one, I'm going to have to demur. Don't consider myself well versed in what the church has been saying on that front. I do think principally you bring up the key point that if I were reading into it, I would want to learn about, which is how do you balance the very difficult prospects of you're going to be hurting effectively non-combatants, if you want to call it that, right? And so I think you have the right principles in mind, and that has to be considered. I don't think the church would be, and I'm definitely stepping beyond my comfort zone here, but just to kind of as a starting place, I don't think the church would have a hard line against sanctions because of that some amount of sanctions could be considered irrelevant of this kind of non-combatant principle. But I suspect there is some point where the church would say, yeah, what you're doing now is not just hurting the leaders and the people who are affecting this war, you are affecting regular people. To use an example where I think the church has said a little bit more, it's not really a war scenario, but the church has been pretty critical of the U.S.'s policy of embargo against Cuba along those exact lines, right? That what we're doing is just harming average Cubans. Castro's sitting pretty, and it doesn't really hurt him all that much. And so what do we think we're accomplishing? So that kind of thinking exists within the church. I just feel like I haven't dug in enough. And maybe there isn't a lot out there. I don't know. So you bring up a really excellent point, and I think it's one to consider doing your own reading on, and I probably am going to be doing some of my own as well. To your other question, the fuzziness of what is the last resort. And yeah, I think intentionally the church here is, it's like, did you notice that in the wording of who the government was, it even feels like they're more cautious about using the word the government. Like, what did it say? The people responsible for the common good. It feels like there's some areas that what the church wants to do is be a little cautious about getting too specific, because they don't want to lock themselves into a corner that they haven't thought through all the possibilities. So again, this is another area where I haven't heard a lot of examples given. We just have to use our best judgment of, when is it a last resort? I think probably an area where we could get some more specificity is along the idea of peace talks. What are you willing to give up, right? And so the last resort principle would say you should be willing to give up a lot more than you might think if you're truly going to treat war as the last resort, right? That no, if we could give up something painful, something we're not happy with, something that leads bad places, but it will prevent war, you should be more willing to consider that, because you're trying to make sure that war is the absolute last resort, and you didn't go to war merely because you weren't willing to compromise more than you were comfortable with. So I think that is an area where they've spoke some to, but again, we're getting vague real quickly. But I've also heard things from the church about, there are problems with appeasement, right? These are not, the church is definitely not trying to say, this is easy, right? There is real evil in the world. And so I think in some degree, because it's difficult, one of the principles that the church has really developed in the last century or so is this idea of, by the hierarchy of the church getting too specific at times in the past, it has boxed us in ways that we didn't intend. And part of the role of the laity, as opposed to the clerics, is to do the messy work of society. Governing, figuring out war, all of that. And so the church's job from a hierarchical perspective is to lay down the principles, knowing that the dirty work of applying those principles is up to good Catholics following their faith to figure out the difficult work. To come with another topic, voting, right? My previous talk on voting, a lot of people find it pretty unsatisfactory because they're looking for an answer of vote for Bob. I hope there's no Bob on the ballot anytime soon, right? Try to pick a name, there's not one. Vote for Bob. The church is never going to do that, or at least the modern church. It is going to say, here are the principles you need to apply, and if you believe that means you should vote for Bob, then we say that's what you should do. But it is the laity's job to go through and do that difficult work. And so I think that would play in this whole space. Yeah. Other questions? All right, yeah. I had a feeling Betty would come up with one eventually. Well, then that's fine. We can have lots of questions, right? Can't promise great answers. Make sure to keep the microphone nice and close.
Yeah, and I'm not I'm not going for a gotcha thing. That's
Sure.
definitely not that. But, I thought that it was kind of interesting where I think the church said that war can only be begun by a properly instituted authority. Okay, so I'm going Hitler, Stalin, are they properly instituted authorities?
As much as this seems wrong, yes, they are. Yeah.
The other thing that came up, and it was is when my sister and I were first discussing how upset we were with the invasion of Ukraine, and she said, I was really surprised that the Russian Orthodox Church kind of came out on the side of Putin.
Mm-hmm.
That does not surprise me at all, because I did take a Russian civilization course and found out that since like the early 1800s, that Russia has seen Moscow as the seat of the Third Holy Roman Empire. So they, from what I understand, the Russian Orthodox Church sees the destruction of the Catholic Church, and that the Third Holy Roman Empire would then be Moscow. First it was Constantinople, then it was Rome, and Rome is in a state of decline, or so they would say. So, so now you've got two sides saying that they have the moral authority to do what they're doing.
Yeah, and actually, at a certain degree, this is in part why the church wants to be a little careful about getting over specific, right? Because actually, you have not heard the Catholic Church be very declarative on who's right and who's wrong here. They've talked about some things they're concerned about, but we have not said, Putin's wrong and Ukraine is right. We for sure have not said that. We've said we're very worried about these reports of genocide. We have said the Pope has made his comments about he's fearing that people aren't willing to go to the peace talks over things like NATO, which they should be willing to do. There have been a number of comments, but none of them have been as declarative as sure as the Russian Orthodox have been, which was very clearly almost bordering on this is a holy war.
They were saying that non-combatants should never be jeopardized.
Targeted, I think is the word. Yeah.
That has been. I don't think that is even as much as I agree with that. That's not modern warfare. What modern warfare has been targeting non-combatants since Spanish-American War, let alone World Wars I and II, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, they go for cities. They go to bring the morale of the people down by murdering non-combatants. Look at what happened with the Jewish people. They were about as non-combatant. And then the Japanese going into China, and what they did to the Chinese is horrifying.
Yeah.
It is horrifying. So, even though, and I was so conflicted about Nagasaki and Hiroshima, because I'm listening to Japanese. In fact, one of my colleagues that I taught with was from Japan, Japanese teacher, and we were introducing ourselves, and I said, where are you from? And she says, Nagasaki. I didn't even know what to say, and I'm just like, oh, yeah. And she said that after the war, the very first people that came to the aid of the Japanese people were American sailors. And she said that her parents wanted her to come and live in the United States because of the compassion of the American sailors, which I thought was just an amazing story. I didn't expect to hear that.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. Most of the medical intervention that happened in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki was American. So even it is a very different thing to say we did the wrong thing than to say we did it with malice knowing it was the wrong thing. And I do believe there are plenty of Americans right up to the president who made the decision who in their heart thought they were doing the right thing. So I don't want to, and I would believe the church would agree with me on this, condemn their intentions, even if their intentions were wrong. And the fact that we would do things like afterwards send in medical help and all of that is a sign that we hadn't lost our compassion, that the mindset had some aspects of good in it. So yeah, it's a messy ball is a different way to say it, for sure. Yeah, and it's we did a lot of good things with how we treated Japan. That's not to say we did everything perfectly, but we did a lot of good things. Actually, I think we hugely learned the lessons of World War I in what we did afterwards, right? One of the big questions, in fact, this is something that Truman insisted upon, and is another one of those things that was an argument of why we could have maybe done this without the nuclear weapons, was we said has to be unconditional surrender. It'll be up to us whether you get to keep the emperor around, right? Now, after the war, we decided to let them do it. We kept him around, which was the right decision, I think, because it was along this principle of treating them with dignity and humanity and recognizing that the emperor was going to be more of a force for helping advance peace than not, and so the U.S. allowed it. That my point is that was very good. That's a sign of us recognizing them, where if we had been more punitive, we just wouldn't have allowed it, and there would have been negative consequences to that. The interesting question becomes, well, if that's what we were going to do, why were we so insistent before the war was over that it had to be something we would decide later, and it had to be an American decision, not something negotiated. But it gets messy really quickly. I feel like I lost an aspect of your question. Okay. Okay. Other questions before we wrap up? Anything coming online? No? Over here, anything? All right, well, let's wrap up. Before we close, I do want to maybe make one kind of final point about the big picture. These are difficult things. It's not easy. It's not easy to know what the right thing to do is. Humility and willing to honestly think about it, what we think will preserve the ideals that we want, even if when we reach those conclusions, they may not be exactly what the church would say, is what I think is so important, is that we come from a place of compassion for life and wanting to, without hyper-emotionalism coming in, do the right thing for life and for the world and for peace. And if we could show, a little bit more compassion to each other when we disagree, and, I've seen people get into the whole Hiroshima debate and get really angry with each other and swear people off. And while I definitely stand on one side of that, I would also say, I get why it's difficult. I get why it's not something easy to agree with. And the right answer to that is to keep dialogue open, be willing to continue to talk, be sympathetic to it is a difficult thing to wrestle with, and compassion for each other as we're debating these things and talking about them is so good, is so important. And I think the way we will find the answers to our future conflicts and our current conflicts like Ukraine is through that kind of mindset, is by willing to have a humble mindset of, okay, here's what I'm concerned about. I'm not so sure. Here's where my mind goes. And then be willing to listen to that same idea from other good actors who are trying to do the same thing. And through that, hopefully we will roll ourselves down the road to a place of good solutions. So, hopefully that is something that came away from this talk, that there's something that you've learned that you're going to say, I feel like I can better be a voice for good in the future. Let's wrap up with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, thank you again for bringing us together this evening and for the many ways that you bless us. As we go forth, we pray especially for those in Ukraine who are affected by this terrible war. Give them peace, give them hope. Let them know that there are people in this world who love and care for them. Also give us the wisdom to know how to bring this terrible conflict to an end. how to make sure the people of Ukraine are protected and their rights, but also if there are means that peace can be found, to be willing to consider it even if it's difficult. We ask all of this through Christ our Lord and Savior. Amen. God bless you all. Have a wonderful evening.